Peki. Şimdi bugün İstanbul Topkapı Üniversitesi İngiliz Dili ve Edebiyatı Bahar Söyleşileri bir başlığı altında üçüncü ve son seminerimizi gerçekleştireceğiz. Bugünkü konuğumuz İstanbul Üniversitesi Edebiyat Fakültesi İngiliz Dili ve Edebiyatı bölümünde doktor öğretim üyesi Sayın Arpine Mızıkyan. Çok kısacık bir şey yapacağım. Arpine Hoca ile alakalı bir konuşma yapmayı planladım. Arpine Hoca ile ben kendi lisans eğitimimde kendisinden ders alma onuruna sahip oldum. 2009, 2010, 2011 yıllarında. Şahsen yani benim için hem akademik anlamda hem genel kültür anlamında işte derslerimizle alakalı üniversite eğitimi nasıl olmalıya dair benim için her zaman muhteşem örneklerden biri olmuştur Arpine hocamız. O yüzden onu yıllar sonra böyle bir etkinlikte burada böyle onunla baş başa olmak benim için inanılmaz bir kıvanç. Bunu söylemeden başlatamazdım bugünkü seminerimizi. Hocam söz sizde.
I am at a complete loss for words. And I'm on cloud nine. Thank you very much. I would like to express my thanks before I start my talk to all the members of this organization. I'm really very happy and very pleased to be a part of these talks and to be here today. The title of my talk is Detective Fiction, an outline of the genre in English literature. First of all, I would like to start talking about what a detective story is and why we read detective stories, what they are and why we read detective stories. And then I'm going to move on the first detective novel in English literature, which is regarded to be Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone, that was published in 1868. But for some people, Dickens's Bleak House, that features Sergeant Beckett, is also thought to be an example of a detective story. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Conan Doyle and his creation of the Sherlock Holmes detective, that eccentric, intelligent detective who is going to make his bow in 1887 with the publication of A Study in Scarlet. And later on, those stories are going to be serialized in the Strand magazine in the 1890s, that the public's imagination will be seized by his stories of this aloof, super intellectual, inhuman detective and his novel methods of scientific deduction. So in a way, I'm going to limit myself to the definition of what a detective story is, why we are reading detective stories, because you're going to see there are very interesting reasons for reading detective stories. And the doctors, especially psychiatrists, came up with some psychoanalytical reasons for reading detective stories. And on the other hand, we have some social reasons that make us read detective stories. And then, as I said, I'm going to move on to Wilkie Collins's Moonstone and then Sherlock Holmes stories, why he was born. In the first place, as you know, if there is no evil, for example, a detective, just like Sherlock Holmes, would not exist. I would like to, first of all, share something. Furkan, bir şey paylaşmak istiyorum. Bana izin vermen lazım.
Şu an çalışıyor olmalı hocam.
Yes. Okay. An important book in this field is Julian Simons's Bloody Murder, From the Detective Story to crime novel, which is a history, and it is an invaluable introductory material for the study of this genre, the classic study of crime fiction. And Julian Simmons, by the way, himself is also a crime story writer. And he claims that actually there are some important points that should be taken into account. And these qualifications are going to help us to decide if a story is a detective story or not. Because I'm going to talk about, for instance, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. As the title of the novel indicates, there is a crime and its punishment, detection and punishment, but it is not thought to be a detective novel. Why? Here you can see the reasons. Because a detective story writer poses a problem, poses a problem in a way, a puzzle to the reader. So a detective story should present a problem, and that problem should be solved by an amateur or professional detective through processes of deduction. So we need a puzzle, and we need the existence of a detective in this context. And deduction also should be taken into account. Deduction, as you know, is the process of making a judgment about something based upon the information that you have. And that is what Sherlock Holmes, for instance, is going to use along with observation, rationality, everything. When we look at, again, the definition of a detective story, that story should be about a mystery, often involving a murder. And that murder, as I said, should be solved by a detective, amateur or professional. Amateur, because you can put yourself in the position of the detective. That is the reason why we are saying amateur. We, of course, have some uncooperative, dim-witted police. On the other hand, detective's confidant, as you have seen here, he's also called a sidekick. Confidant with an E is the feminine form, or associate, just like Dr. Watson, Sherlock Holmes's friend, or Captain Hastings in Christie's Hercule Poirot stories. Anyway, a close friend who is also the narrator of the novel, of the story, and narrator or chronicler or recorder. We need a Watson, because if Sherlock Holmes is superior to the others, the superiority must be demonstrated. We need Watson in order to see how superior Sherlock Holmes is. That is the reason why a character like Dr. Watson, a sidekick, is created. And confidant is someone, especially in drama and occasionally in fiction, someone who has very little effect upon the action, but whose function is to listen to the intimate feelings and thoughts of the protagonist. For instance, he's Horatio, a trusted friend in Shakespeare's Hamlet. And of course, we have a variety of suspects because there's a crime or the stealing of something, a criminal, a variety of suspects, and very carefully laid red herrings to put the reader off the scent, and a suspect who seems to be, in a way, guilty from circumstantial evidence. And at the same time, at the end, we have a resolution, which is also called denouement in the French language, and which the detective reveals how he has found out the culprit. The good detective story displays impeccable logic and reasoning in its unraveling. And here, I'm going to talk about the Bible. I'm going to talk about literature which is full of murders. The Bible. Why the Bible? Because in the beginning there was guilt. And the Bible is also full of murders. And I mean, the Bible as the book of Western civilization and culture, full of murders. For instance, Adam and Eve, the relationship between them. The Garden of Eden, a kind of society with its own regulations and laws. And there is an important injunction, an important prohibition in that society. I'm talking about the Garden of Eden, and it is thou, as God says to Adam, first of all, and then to Eve, thou shalt not eat the forbidden fruit, which is usually designated as an apple in Western culture. But of course, the Bible never specifies what kind of fruit it was. But modern, popular folk religion has always related it to an apple. That is the reason why I'm going to refer to that fruit as an apple. Thou shalt not eat the fruit. But of course, Eve, because she's going to be seduced by Satan in the form of a serpent, is going to steal the apple, right? And then she's going to taste it. You see, I am underlining the word stealing because the first detective novel, Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone, is about the stealing of something. It's about the stealing of the moonstone, that is, in a way, an object, a very precious diamond, which had once been set in the forehead of an image of the Indian moon god. And it is in an Indian shrine, and it is going to be stolen by an English officer. So Eve is going to steal the forbidden fruit, and she's going to give it to Adam, knowing that Adam is going to die. But of course, as you know, Christian ideology requires that man be satisfied with the knowledge that he has and should refrain from endeavoring to attain that transcendental knowledge, which is a prerogative of God. And because Eve aspires to the Godhead, strives for godliness, so that she falls. And in Milton's reading, and Milton's famous epic poem, Puritan epic poem, Paradise Lost, causes the fall of man, his loss of innocence, purity, virtue, and most significant of all, immortality. So death, here we have something that becomes universal. Death, fascinating, mysterious. It is one of the fascinating subjects in a detective story. Loss, death, because it is, as I said, mysterious, interesting, frightening, but at the same time very chaotic, because there's no theorizing about death. We know we're going to die, but how and when, we have no idea about that, unless we commit suicide. So here we have it's doing something. It's in a way, it's a sin, a big sin committed by the first man and woman. So they are going to fall. So Eve is going to break the law, break the rule established by God. And in the biblical context, the detective is God, distant, omniscient. He knows everything. Just like who? The detective who is going to be created by Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes. Just like God. A godlike figure Sherlock Holmes is. And so that is the crime story and the Bible. The story of humanity begins with this stealing incident. So does the story of first English detective novel. And then, as you see here, literature is full of murders, I say. Fairy tales. We have lots of murder stories. For example, the Snow White, the Little Red Riding Hood. The Snow White, the stepmother, will attempt at killing the stepdaughter with a poisonous apple. Again, here we have apple, and that is poisonous. Or Sophocles' tragedy, Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex. It is a tragedy. Again, I have to underscore that genre. It's a tragedy. And it is, on the other hand, a quintessential crime story. And in this tragedy, we have Oedipus, the character who's looking for the murderer of his father. And at the end, it turns out that he himself is the criminal. So actually, a good detective story is the one in which the detective, and by the way, Oedipus is a kind of detective in that context. The good detective story is the one in which the detective at the end finds out that the criminal he has been looking for, he has been seeking throughout the story is himself. And here we have that. He's going to punish himself by pulling out his eyes, and Jocasta, the mother, wife, is going to hang herself. And then we come to Shakespeare and the majority of his plays, for instance, Hamlet or Macbeth. There we have Hamlet, the King Hamlet is going to be killed. And the ghost of the king is going to ask his son to take revenge for his own murder. But Macbeth or Hamlet, here we have a power struggle between men. Yes, here we have a crime and its detection and punishment. And at the end, we have the restoration of the order. That is all we need in a detective story. But again, these are plays and they are not about the process of deduction. And Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, for instance, the title very clearly indicates that it is about a crime and its punishment. Okay, Raskolnikov. But what is important here is that what is underlined, what is brought into the foreground is that is not, well, I mean, the detective in the figure of Sherlock Holmes' character, but the idea of redemption is what is brought into the foreground. Redemption, that is the change that takes place in the character. So the reason why I have just mentioned all these texts is that they include a crime, an important priority in a detective fiction. Okay, I mean, we cannot call a story without a crime, a detective story without a crime. Okay, but of course, the fact that there is a crime does not make that work a detective novel or a detective story. Because here, what is important is the objective of the writer. Dostoevsky's objective is to talk about the idea of redemption. Shakespeare, the struggle between men. Sophocles, the struggle between fathers and sons. And in the biblical context, again, yeah, we have a struggle, but of course it is, in the biblical context, it is a kind of disobedience against the ultimate creator God and their punishment. They're being thrown out of the carefree Garden of Eden, which is, of course, as I said, a kind of society with its own rules and regulations. They're going to disobey because otherwise everything starts off promising. A very beautiful and magnificent garden. I have no idea about how magnificent it is because I've never been to the Garden of Eden, but swimming fish, flying boats, and a couple to cultivate it. But something is going to happen and things will begin to go downhill immediately. And that is what Adam and Eve are going to do against God. Now, there's an important novel, an early instance of a novel that deals with crime and detection in some depth is William Godwin's The Adventures of Caleb Williams. The subtitle is Things as They Are, published right at the end of the 18th century. And as you know, William Godwin is the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, a pioneer of women's emancipation movement, a vindication of the rights of women, she wrote, and at the same time the father of Mary Shelley, who would also Frankenstein. The Adventures of Caleb Williams, or Things as They Are, as I said, crime and detection. But of course here, by using Caleb Williams as the protagonist, what the author is trying to display is political oppression. So the aim of the writer is political. And he is also talking about, in this particular novel, corrupt hierarchies. And he's trying to show how legal and other institutions can and do destroy individuals, even when the people the justice system touches are innocent of any guilt, any crime. But prior to, the detective fiction as a recognizable form was Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in the Graham's magazine in 1841. It is regarded to be the first detective story, and it's detective by the name of Auguste Dupin. I'm giving the English pronunciation of the name and the surname of the detective, who is going to be the first fictional detective, because he's going to demonstrate some traits which became literary conventions in other fictional detectives. For instance, Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. And two works that share some similarities predate Poe's stories. Voltaire, an important figure in the Age of Enlightenment, he published Zadig in the 18th century, in which the eponymous hero, philosopher, hero solves problems of detection with a combination of logic and observation, to which, Sherlock Holmes could not have improved on. And on the other hand, we have, and in this sense, Voltaire must also be considered a pioneer. And plus, we have E.T.A. Hoffman, and she's Mademoiselle de Chaudery, and in a way, she is thought to be the 19th century Miss Marple, because she's going to establish the innocence of a character who is suspected by the police in the murder of a jeweler. And there is much debate as to when British crime fiction was really born, though Wilkie Collins can perhaps lay claim to the first English detective novel in the shape of the Moonstone that was published in 1868, one man in particular remains as a pioneer, and that is, as I said at the beginning of my talk, Arthur Conan Doyle and his creation of a male detective, Sherlock Holmes, and his introduction to the world in 1887. And I told you that I'm going to go back to Sherlock Holmes, but the reasons, they are very important. In the first place, of course, we are reading detective stories. Why? To amuse ourselves, to spend leisure time. A very simplistic approach to the reasons for reading detective stories. Okay, alone in our room, in our solitude, we are reading crime stories. We are interested in reading about crimes perpetrated by our own kind. Okay, now I'm going to talk about why. Because, as I said, there are some psychological reasons. And this person, the psychiatrist, and what he publishes, he writes on the reasons, psychological reasons for reading detective stories. He says, first of all, a detective story offers a pleasurable excitement removed from the realities of our own life. What is that? Well, we are, social creatures, respectable people, and we are interested in reading about crimes and their detection, or thrillers in which the characters did things that we normally would have strongly disapproved. In the first place, we are allowed to identify with the criminal. We become the criminal in the process of our reading a detective story or a novel. And this can safely be done because the story is sufficiently removed from reality. But at the same time, we know that the superego, so in the first place, our eating impulses are satisfied because we are becoming the criminal. And on the other hand, the superego is also gratified because we know that the superego in the form of a detective or in the form of a policeman is going to come into the picture, catch the criminal, the culprit, and the order is going to be restored. So it is going to provide us with a sense of satisfaction or security, but it's very interesting because we're going to feel satisfied or content by the death of another human being. And we know that the order that we have is going to survive. It's very significant. And according to another doctor, Charles Rycroft, in his psychoanalytical, the article that was published in the Psychoanalytical Quarterly, he claims that a detective story has its origins and the primal sin of infancy. What is that? Here the crime represents parental intercourse, and the victim is the parent, and the clues are the representations of nocturnal sounds, incomprehensible adult jokes, or stains. And here, the detective, the reader, satisfied his infantile curiosity by becoming the detective, thus redressing the, in a way, helpless inadequacy and anxious guilt unconsciously remembered from childhood. That is what he said. These are the psychological reasons. As I said, first of all, the id impulse is satisfied, and later on, the superego. On the other hand, we have the social reasons. Of course, social reasons, what they are, a detective story is always on the side of law and order. But of course, this was not always true, and it is not altogether true now. But for Collins, Wilkie Collins, for Arthur Conan Doyle, and the 20th century writers, the detective story was certainly on the side of law and order. Here, the question that we've got to ask, why I'm saying that, because the readers, they were usually the middle classes and the upper middle classes. What does it mean, the readers, middle classes or upper middle classes? Because here they had a certain amount of money, property, and they wanted they wanted to maintain their status quo because they had everything to lose by social change. And they wanted the permanence of the existing order. So in this sense, what detective or crime literature offered to its readers was a reassuring world in which those who attempted to disrupt the existing order, the prevalent order, were caught and punished. And the detective, in this sense, is only character who is endowed with some scientific attainments, intellectual attainments, and he is, as I said, an amateur, mostly, just like Auguste Dupin and Sherlock Holmes, so that you can put yourself in his place and his shoes. Mostly eccentric, just like Sherlock Holmes, omniscient in practice, and he's allowed to be above law. He does the things that for a character less privileged would have been punishable. In this case, we have the aloof, super intellectual and human detective Sherlock Holmes, who is the savior of society, and most of the time he does illegal things for the right reasons, and he's not punished. So here, the question that should be asked is, where do you make the demarcation between a detective and a criminal? Because probably you have seen in many Sherlock Holmes stories, Sherlock Holmes himself, the detective, in a way, I've just talked about a detective fiction should be on the side of law and order. And here you can see, for instance, we have order versus chaos, and the detective on the side of light and order, while the criminal on the side of darkness and chaos or evil, right? But if Sherlock Holmes himself becomes a murderer, if detective fiction has been branded as escape literature, what are we going to escape to? Because we are escaping from chaos, from a chaotic situation, and into a safer one. But here, if the detective himself turns out to be the criminal, can we talk about order? Can we talk about the satisfaction of that order? Can we talk about a sense of security? No. Probably that is the fascination of literature. It is, in a way, subversive in one way or another. Now, the first detective novel, The Moonstone, now I'm going to talk about the reasons for the emergence of the first detective novel in England. It is not, I mean, if you look at the publication date, the publication year of the Moonstone, you see that that is the second half of the 19th century, and it is no coincidence that detective fiction began to be written in England during the mid-19th century, because the Victorian period is an important age in English history when the bourgeoisie was a social and political force very conscious of its own potentials and powers. And the middle-class Victorian bourgeois, aware of the enormous progress that he had made in terms of wealth and power, wanted to maintain the existing order the status quo. And with this aim in mind, the middle class Victorian very forcefully reacted against any change, or any movement or endeavor for change, which it thought was threatened its quasi-secure position. And this conservative reaction is seen, for example, in the middle class response to the subversive aspect of literature and the arts. These are the fields that tended to question and deviate from ordinary norms, accepted norms, traditional norms, and practices. And thus, one form this sphere took was Philistinism. As you know, Philistinism, the act of, not appreciating art. And granted, there were some perils in the future that the Victorian bourgeois patriarch consistently feared. Carlyle and Disraeli, two important intellectuals, and Disraeli is the first Jewish prime minister in England. All those intellectuals all over the country discussed the condition of England because they believed that the two sects, the middle or upper middle classes on the one hand, and the working classes would one day part England between them. So, as I said, throughout the country, they discussed the condition of England question. And moreover, after the French Revolution, and especially in the late 1840s, Europe had become a theater of strife between social classes. Nationalist, egalitarian, liberalist, and socialist movements began to gain impetus in some important countries, such as France, Italy, Hungary, and Germany. So the middle class bourgeois began to see himself as the anxious spectator of an impending chaos, which he thought would also find fertile ground in his own country. On the other hand, moreover, due to the wide discrepancy in the distribution of wealth and to the general ineffectiveness of some social institutions, such as the church, that served to curb disorderly impulses, the bourgeoisie was forced to recognize the danger of a possibly vindictive and rebellious working class. And this long-suffering class had its justifiable causes for a revolt. However, in the event of a revolt, the bourgeoisie feels that the very edifice that he had established would be threatened by demolition. So in this case, you see their social status, they place in that society, but on the one hand, and on the other hand, their property. So they have got to do something. And here we have wealth and property, the bone of contention between the social classes, as far as the bourgeoisie could see, constituted the very foundation of the socio-political system. And it is not surprising to see that the emphasis was laid upon the sanctity of wealth, to which the bourgeoisie owned its social status. So in this case, security became a key word. So we need an organized security system, the police force. And it was in 1829 that, as a result of the then great endeavors of Home Secretary Robert Peel, the Metropolitan Police Act became law, and then and consequently London acquired a security force consisting of paid constables, who were to be commanded by two justices, later to be called commissioners. Their headquarters were in Whitehall Place, in a building, the back of which opened on a courtyard called Scotland Yard. But quite interestingly, they were universally disliked until 1833, when an inquest investigating the killing of one and the wounding of 3 policemen by the mob during a public demonstration, it was blatantly in a way mishandled by both the law courts and the government, and as a result of which the police gained the sympathy of the public. And it was only in 1856, however, that the provinces came under the jurisdiction of a professional police force. So by the time Wilkie Collins published the Moonstone in 1868, and according to T.S. Eliot, this novel is the first, the longest and the best of English detective novels, the English bourgeoisie had already established a police force in order to protect its wealth and property. And the detective genre, again, according to T.S. Eliot's conception, invented by Wilkie Collins, flourished in England, producing a type of detective fiction which was different from its equivalents in America and Europe, especially in its handling of character and plot. And crime as handled by English detective writers from Collins to Agatha Christie is a much more domestic affair, disturbing the very peace and security of a very bourgeois group of people. And in this sense, the house plays, as a microcosm of society, a significant role, and the Englishman's home being his castle. And the characters under threat are predominantly upper middle classes, and their social status is underscored by the dwelling that they have. So it is both their own and their houses, harmonious order that the lawbreaker endangers. Again, thank God, the early 20th century also introduced the female sleuths, Miss Marple, for instance, by Agatha Christie. Actually, Agatha Christie, as I said, belonging to the golden period of detective fiction, along with Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham, and Negayo Marsh, to name a few, is going to make, in a way, her bow with the publication of her novel, the first novel, that is Mysterious Affair at Styles in 1920. And then we're going to have Poirot story starting. Miss Marple's, as you know, her advanced age emphasizes her remoteness and alienation from the new woman type. The new woman meaning the emancipist, the appearance of the new woman, especially in the birth of Sherlock Holmes, and because this new woman is going to pose a big threat to male order, male authority, and her ancestry and respectability affiliate her, Miss Marple, to the ruling patriarchal forces. And in general, the plot of an English detective novel is centered around the struggle between patriarchal forces of law reinforcement and the descendant of a Gothic hero who is bent upon demolishing that prevalent order. Here, it is forced through a rational and scientific investigation that the detective, to whom the ultimate power of the patriarchal figure has been relegated, catches the culprit, and ultimately the order is restored. I'm repeating the same words, the same sentence, the restoration of the order. That is what we expect. For example, at the end of the Moonstone, we have the restoration of that order in a detective story. Order is a key word, just like crime, just like a detective. The detective, of course, should be helped by the testimonies of the innocent characters. And sometimes they refuse to speak. That lack of communication in itself causes chaos. Results in a complete sense of chaos in its own making. However, the detective is the only character who is endowed with some scientific, let's say, qualities, abilities. Here, for example, Sherlock Holmes' pure intellect, as he is the first representative of the completely scientific-minded English detective, because Englishman's mind, and especially late middle-class Victorian Englishman's mind, is seen as a source of salvation, since man is endowed with all-encompassing potential. So it is not without reason that detective fiction has been branded as escape literature. And I would like to talk a little bit about Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone, the first detective novel it is regarded. And Wilkie Collins's Moonstone is marked by its, in a way, by the sophistication of its formal technique. What I mean by this is that it is well illustrated in the fact that it was first published in installments in a weekly periodical all the year round. It was founded and owned by Charles Dickens. And for many scholars, what Collins did for the development of English novel was his concern and success with the idea of form. And it is very well illustrated in the framework, in the whole of the novel, in the Moonstone. And of course, when I say he was so much concerned with the idea of the form, it is pertinent as far as a detective novel is concerned, because the inherent purpose of a detective novel is to reassert the prevalence of order within the society. For instance, if we are talking about order, or that the structure of the novel, it starts with a prologue, a kind of introduction, which consists of 6 pages. And this prologue is going to give us an account of the historical background of the Moonstone. By the way, the Moonstone is a very precious, diamond, a yellow diamond. The title is also very significant, and the title of the work, as you know, gives us a lot of clues about the very content of the novel. Moon, why? Moon, for instance. And this prologue also gives us a historical background of the Moonstone, as I said, and the narrative technique of the novel. So the Moonstone, once upon a time, was an India, its natural habitat, and it fell into the possession of many men, and finally came into the possession of an English officer by the name of Horncastle, Colonel Horncastle, an English officer, during the siege of Seringapatam. And it is an actual event in British history, in the British occupation of India. And this English officer is going to give the Moonstone as a present to his niece on her 80th birthday. So it is going to be transported to England, to an alien soil, where it is going to become, in a way, a malign and hostile force, because India as a continent is essentially, in a way, alien and disordered as far as the English are concerned. And in doing so, of course, John Horncastle is going to trigger off a wave of chaos and destruction, not only in India, but at the same time in England, where he transports a diamond. And of course, we have the main body of the novel. First of all, a prologue, as I said, and the main body. And finally, an epilogue. Epilogue also consists of 6 pages almost. And it, in a way, also includes different contributions from various characters, the purpose of which is to reach denouement, a resolution, and to work down what has finally happened to the Moonstone. And thank God it was taken out of England, where it served to bring only destruction and chaos, and it was taken back to its natural habitat, that is India. So in a way, the peace has been restored, not only in England, but at the same time in India. You see here, order. And the novel comes full cycle to where it began, as if the whole episode had never taken place. We get that sense of order, the restoration of order at the end of the novel. As I said, 3 parts, roughly speaking: a prologue, an introduction, the main body, and an epilogue, right? Because the writer is trying to say that life outside the novel is very chaotic. By creating a symmetrical form, it tries to, in a way, create the sense of order. Look at my novel. It is possible to create that sense of order outside my novel, outside my creation, my composition. That is what he's trying to say. That is the Moonstone. And now I'm going to come to our famous eccentric, my favorite detective, Sherlock Holmes. First of all, I would like to talk a little bit about the cultural, political, social background of Britain in the final decades of the 19th century. The period of the late 1880s was a turbulent one in British history, and it is this turbulence which has most immediate relevance to the appearance of the detective, and in particular to the emergence of Sherlock Holmes and its repercussions. At At the beginning of my talk, I told you that if there is no evil, by the way, Sherlock Holmes would not exist. Why he was so much admired, why he has been so much admired, there must be some reasons behind it. Because Sherlock Holmes, in the first place, fulfilled some important needs on the part of English people. They wanted a paradigm of masculinity, a personification of masculinity, by looking at Sherlock Holmes, reading his stories. Because Sherlock Holmes' stories constructed a masculine script, and they confirmed qualities which were radically gendered as masculine in Victorian culture. For instance, rationality, observation, factuality, and logic. Those were the qualities that had lost their significance as a result of some important factors. Now I'm going to talk about that. In the final decades of the 19th century, there were some cultural factors that contributed to the deployment of the Sherlock Holmes paradigm, the deployment of gender modeling in the Sherlock Holmes paradigm. In the first place, British Empire. It was a necessity of controlling the empire, and the anxieties stemming from this pressure, and the defeats of Britain. For instance, in the Afghan War and the First World War. War, it means farmer, and these were the wars between Britain and Britain's colonized places in South Africa. So in the final decades of the 19th century, Britain began to lose some, its colonies in India, in Pakistan, in South Africa. Very significant. Why? Because British economy was supported by the colony support, and as a result of the rise of the nationalistic movements, they began to rebel against British hegemony, British supremacy, and Britain began to lose ground. It was falling apart as far as its colonies were concerned. And on the other hand, we have two important world powers, America and Germany. They pose challenges to British economic and political supremacy in the world. America was assuming a prominence that challenged Britain in different respects. And Britain, as a result of these, began to experience a very precarious state, a very precarious position. And for this reason, it is possible to read many Sherlock Holmes stories as a kind of warning to Britain against the masculinity represented by American men, a warning Britain about the nature of Americans, who are generally described as cunning, greedy, scheming, and violent. And of course, such attitudes are governed by ideological conceptions prevailing during the late Victorian and the early Edwardian periods. Or, for example, in a Sherlock Holmes story, British manliness, represented by Sherlock Holmes, is strongly contrasted with the masculine norm of America. The tale reflects, on the one hand, the anxiety at the increasing power of this country, America, and concern that its masculine paradigms are dangerous, atavistic, and reversionary to a mode of bestiality and at the same time lawlessness. Here we have, first of all, two important world powers, America and Germany, threats to British manliness, and at the same time the colonized places rebelling against British hegemony. And of course, we have, on the other hand, inside the country and outside, the appearance of the new woman, emancipist she was called, who demanded sexual, political, and educational parity with men. And they destabilized male conceptions of legal, sexual, and marital affiliations. And they also demanded for access to professions and occupations. And again, this demand was perceived by males as threats to their hegemony and the economy. So, on the other hand, the waning of Victorianism, the continuing impact of industrialization and urbanization, the appearance of the new woman, colonial nationalism, the United States and Germany, were among the challenges to British male identity, which resulted in what an important critic, Elaine Showalter, in her sexual anarchy calls a crisis of masculinity. In society that would necessitate the reinforcement of masculine paradigms. And women, for instance, inside the country began to rebel against male oppression in public places. They started to make their demonstrations in public places. In doing so, of course, they became more observable. So to be a man in those times was very difficult because patriarchy was challenged from different directions. I mean, inside and outside the country, and plus inside the country, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, people were moving from, I mean, transition from the countryside to the cities. So the demography of Britain was on the increase, overpopulation, unemployment, strikes, terrorism, and consequently, the stability of social organizations could not be assumed. You see, British manliness was besieged by challenges both internal and external. On the other hand, we have an important scientist, Darwin. To make things worse, there was a challenge of the new science to the old Christian faith. Darwin's theory of evolution shook the assumption that humanity was in some way the final grand product of creation. When we look at the biblical story, the first man, I mean, Adam was created in the image of God, and Adam has some kind of divinity, and he's the only one who is endowed with reason that makes him the head of all the beasts on earth. But Godwin is going to do something very challenging. He's going to say something very challenging on the origin of species by means of natural selection, the name of his work, in 1857. And he's going to make man akin to an ape, an animal ruled by base instinct, thereby wresting from him his claim to rational thought and a system of morality on which his primacy was erected. On the other hand, and most important of all, we have Darwin's of sexual selection and the female choice. It is the female who chooses her mate, and it also shattered, deconstructed the traditional sexual hierarchy. In Genesis, Adam is created first, and Eve as a companion, as a helpmate to Adam. So secondary. I mean, Eve is a contingent and secondary creation of Adam. But also, the female is subservient to the male. An important notion that was further suggested by the popular figure of the Victorian angel in the house. All these were challenged by Darwin's dominant sexual female, who emerged as a threat, as a rival to the male. So once those strict lines of demarcation between human and animal, as well as between man and woman, were profoundly blurred, Victorian men found themselves to be haunted by a nightmare of anxiety and chaos. Their manhood, their humanity were at stake, a danger that provoked great anxiety and resentment. So these are the problems that gave birth to the emergence of Sherlock Holmes and its repercussions in literature. And Conan Doyle is going to write between 1887, as I said, that is a publication of the first story, Study in Scarlet, and he's going to write till 1927 for almost 40 years. But the creator, Sherlock Holmes, his popularity, his fame was so great that at the end of the 19th century, in a tale, he wanted to kill him. Conan Doyle wanted to kill Sherlock Holmes because his fame surpassed that of the creator. But of course, the public outcry was so powerful that she was obliged to call him back in the final case. He wanted to kill him by using his big enemy, Professor Moriarty. But of course, Sherlock Holmes is going to become alive again. Not easy to kill him. And what kind of a character is he? As you know, in most of the stories, bohemian habits. he has a late riser and heavy smoker. For instance, heavy smoker, why? Sherlock Holmes is pure intellect. And if he is pure intellect, his body must be ignored. And for this reason, for instance, Sherlock Holmes in an armchair, coiled like a snake, he's almost invisible. Like God, we could not see him. And Dr. Watson will not be able to see Sherlock Holmes. And his addiction to cocaine, for instance, and he's interested in playing the violin. And Sherlock Holmes is also immune from ordinary human weaknesses. Human weaknesses, and here I mean emotions, for instance, animal instincts, because he's a godlike figure. For this reason, he has to be immune from ordinary human weaknesses. There is no woman in his life except for an old housekeeper in his house on Baker Street, 221, and one woman, an opera singer who was born in New Jersey, Irene Adler. He's going to be attracted to him, but of course here that attraction is not because of the fact that she's very beautiful, physically speaking, but her intellect, her aptitude, for instance, for disguising herself as somebody else is going to captivate Sherlock Holmes' attention. For this reason, he's interested in Irene Adler. What else? Dr. Watson, as I said, the sidekick in many Sherlock Holmes tales, and we need a character just like Dr. Watson, because the brilliant intelligence of the detective is made to shine more brightly through the comparative stupidity of Dr. Watson. And it has become a fixed pattern for the creation of other detectives. For example, Christie's Hercule Poirot and his sidekick, Captain Hastings. Dr. Watson is a man of medicine. Unlike Sherlock Holmes, he's married. And Captain Hastings the same, he's married. And he was once a British officer in the army. I mean, Hercule Poirot, Poirot's sidekick. What else can I say about Sherlock Holmes? And quite interestingly, Sherlock Holmes represents the so-called normative masculinity. What I mean by that is that, I mean, from the very beginning of my talk, I said the idea of order in a detective story. Normative masculinity is the one that represents order. Sherlock Holmes is called upon to please, for example, male desire and male anarchy. And he's the one who has to get rid of the threat represented to the dominant masculine order. And on the other hand, normative masculinity, yes, but there must be something against it, and that is criminal behavior, which is named as transgressive masculinity. And that usually turns out to be the criminal. I mean, the one who is opposed to Sherlock Holmes. And I posed an important question. I said that, where are we going to make the demarcation between the detective and the murderer? It is explicitly seen in the case of Sherlock Holmes. At the end of most stories, as he himself admits at denouement, he says, for example, he's indirectly responsible for the deaths of the criminal, but he cannot bring himself to feel any remorse because of that. Why, for instance, Sherlock Holmes can call the police and can inform the police about the incident. They can come and do something for the case, but he doesn't do that because Sherlock Holmes is the agent of scientific reason and justice. And he unlocks the mysteries of the criminal's identity and motive, not to confer benefit on society, but to enjoy the intellectual stimulus of pure reasoning, which affords him the same pleasure as his violin, or perhaps more darkly, his addiction to cocaine. So at the end, if the detective is a criminal, it provides the reader with a sense of dissatisfaction and instability of that order. Yet the idea that true order is stronger than society's order and is a final court of appeal. And the fact that such a court might exist personified by an individual is quite comforting to the readers. My last sentence is going to be to conclude. The best crime stories are not simply entertainments, but literature. Thanks a lot for listening and for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this extensive talk on the genre detective fiction. If members of the audience have any questions, you may turn on your microphone and direct your questions directly to our guest professor today, or alternatively, you may type them down in the chat, and I may voice them for you.
May I?
Sure, of course.
Okay, yes, really, I would like to thank you, Dr. Arpine, for this very interesting talk. You let us get more information about the background of the detective novel. Just reading it on the surface as a crime-solving problem would be difficult to understand what is really at the basic of detective novel. And as you said, I completely agree with you. Detective novels are the epitomes of crises of masculinity. And in this respect, would you agree? Well, there are some critics who argue that Western novel is also a subgenre of detective novels. Would you accept this? Would you like to elaborate on this subject? And I also agree with you that at the very beginning, there were some certain rules, and these rules were set by Todorov at the very beginning. And afterwards, we see some distractions from the topic. But first of all, I would like to know whether you consider Western novels, Western fiction in American literature as a subgenre of detective novel. Because in the Western novel, there are good guys and bad guys. There's a crime committed, and this crime is either solved by the sheriff or the cowboy. So do you think Western novels or films can be considered as subgenre of detective literature?
You mentioned, thank you very much for this question, Professor Önder. You said cowboys and the Wild West. Are you referring yourself to a hard-boiled movement in literature?
Yeah, both. But mainly my interest is in Western fiction, Western novels taking place in American literature, not hard-boiled fiction, but Western novels mainly.
I mean, as you said, there is that endless struggle between good and evil that characterizes human history. And I started giving my example by referring myself to the Bible. There was guilt in the beginning. Of course, I mean, the Anglo-Saxon literature and Christianity, from a Christian point of view, everything is based upon that idea of guilt. And what we are trying to do, that sense of order, is actually a strong desire, a penchant for a return to the Garden of Eden, actually. I mean, to create that order, to create a counterpoint to that order, a counterpart to that order, something which is going to be very similar to that, something that we lost. As you know, that melancholy title the epic poem Paradise Lost. We lost something. It was a paradise, very beautiful, magnificent place, and we lost it. So, as you said, as you have argued, that eternal struggle between good and evil, between light and darkness, let's say, between God and Satan, will never end. Yes, why not? I mean, Western literature, Western novels can also be thought to be just the, did you say just the opposite? I mean, detective.
No, as a subgenre, yes.
As a subgenre, why not? Yeah, I agree with you. And second thing, something else, another question you had.
Do you think that there should be a structure which is typical for a detective novel?
Yeah, to call a novel a detective novel, we need a structure. Sayers, for instance, by basing herself upon Aristotle's definition of the plot, she claims that a detective story should have a beginning, a development, the main body, and an end. At the same time, Aristotle, in his Poetics, while talking about a good plot, he says that it should have a climax, right, and a resolution at the end. And that is what we have, for example, a conflict, a problem, that is the puzzle, that is the mystery. Then a climax, it is going to reach to a climax, and finally we're going to come to a resolution. That is the denouement, in which the detective is going to reveal how he has found out the murderer. That is the structure. Yes, I agree. If we are, if we want to call a story a detective story, we need that structure. It is inevitable. Otherwise, it is not going to be a detective story. It can be, for example, I gave the example from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Yeah, crime and punishment, but it is not called a detective novel. Right?
Okay, thank you.
No more questions?
Furkan Hocam, you need to turn on your microphone. We couldn't hear you.
Yeah, I forgot to do that. Yeah, well, I don't personally have a question, but yeah, if anyone else has any questions, you can still allocate some minutes for that.
There's a message.
I think we're gonna have no more questions, right? Yeah. All right then. Well, Professor Arpine Mızıkyan, it's been such a pleasure to listen to you again. Personally, for me, after many years, for me, it's been as much of a privilege and a pleasure to listen to you now as it was back then in 2010 and 11, if not more. So thank you so much for the talk today.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
And
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. And we'd be delighted to have you back again sometime soon later as part of perhaps another seminar series. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Hocam, thank you so much for this enlightening talk.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm really very happy to participate in those talks. Thank you very much for your invitation.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome. All right. Before we close the session, just a quick reminder: the second part of the seminar series is going to continue in the middle of May, and the first professor to give a seminar as part of the second series is going to be none other than Assistant Professor Özlem Karadağ on May the 17th. She is just like our current guest professor, Arpine Mızıkyan. She's from İstanbul University, the Faculty of Letters, English Language and Literature. And she's going to do us the honor of giving her a seminar on May the 7th. So again, thank you to everyone for participating, to all our professors and students, as well as over the course of the last hour and some 20 minutes, we have had some surge of ex-Istanbul University classmates of mine. I've been very happy to see their faces, to see them join in and listen to you as well. To sort of, this has, for us at least, has been an opportunity to sort of reconnect. So it has served many purposes. So again, thank you to everyone. Have a nice, wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Thank you everyone for joining us.